Welcome to the Door Roller Money Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Berger. Today, in episode 301, we're going to talk about tax loss harvesting. This is something that I've been dealing with in the last month or so, and I thought, well, it's a good opportunity to revisit it, make sure we understand what it is, make sure I understand what it is, and how to use it, and how to avoid misusing it, because you can get into some trouble with tax loss harvesting if you don't know what you're doing. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Before we get there, though, I wanted to mention three things in the news that I thought were interesting. The first one, by the way, has absolutely nothing to do with finance, but is in some ways infinitely more important. And of course, you know it has to deal with chess. It's probably the preeminent chess club in the United States. It used to be, well, maybe some would argue it still is in Manhattan. But today, probably St. Louis. That's where the Chess Hall of Fame is. And a phenomenal chess club. And it is made possible by the Sinquefields, who are a family in St. Louis, I guess a wealthy family. They've sort of funded the Chess Hall of Fame, as I understand it, and this chess club. But I've been there. It's a remarkable place, if you're a chess fan anyway. And in fact, I heard a lecture by Sarawan, Grandmaster Sarawan, who's he's sort of retired from competitive chess now, but just a remarkable guy, and he's the kind of guy you just immediately like. He's a very nice man, phenomenal chess player. And in any event, the reason I bring this up is here in August, I'm not quite sure when this podcast will get published, but through the 28th of August, 2018, they're playing the Sinquefield Cup. They play it every year, obviously named after the founders or the backers of this chess club, and it brings basically roughly the 10 best players in the world, more or less. It includes the number one player, Magnus Carlsen. He's playing in the tournament. It also includes Caruana, who is from the U.S., and he is going to be playing Carlsen for the championship in London in, I think, October or November of this year. So they're both in this tournament along with a number of other players. And you can watch it along with live commentary, believe it or not, including from Sarawan, at chess24.com, chess and then 24.com. And so I don't know, if you like chess or you're interested in it, you might want to check it out. It's a lot of fun. At least for me. Okay, the second thing that caught my attention actually happened a week or two ago, and that is New York City finally, and my wife and I were just there for our 30th wedding anniversary, 30 years. Can you imagine she's stuck with me that long? Remarkable. They have decided to cap the number of Uber and Lyft drivers, I think at 100,000. And the excuse, and I do mean excuse because it's an absolutely absurd restriction in my humble opinion, was so that they could study it free. They need to study. I'm not sure why they need to limit the number of Uber and Lyft drivers to study it, but apparently they do. And of course, the cabbies, the taxi drivers and the medallion owners were thrilled, of course. They hate Uber and Lyft because of the competition. It's I've read that it's brought the value of a medallion down from $1 million to $200,000 because obviously there's now competition. And so the taxi drivers were thrilled about this. And I just thought, what a sad state of affairs. You've got this remarkably inventive industry where they've pulled us out of the 1950s as a practical matter into the 21st century. Consumers obviously love Uber and Lyft because we're using it, right? Drivers like it. Now, there's some complaint about the pay, but apparently the pay is good enough to attract a lot of drivers. Why not let the market decide? Why not let you and I, the consumer, and you and I, the Uber and Lyft drivers, decide how many drivers and riders there are going to be? Why does the government need to step in and say, no, we know better than everyone else. We're going to set the limits. And I thought, sad for those folks who were going to become Uber drivers. Now they can't, right? They were going to earn some extra money, maybe to save, to pay on the car payment, to feed their family. Sorry, the politicians, the technocrats have decided you can't do that. And it just disgusts me. Anyway, yeah, they've capped it. It's funny, we were in New York City, and then I was in Jersey City, all roughly in the same week. And at one point, I took a cab, and it was awful. He wouldn't turn the air conditioning on. The windows, were down, but it was hot. Cab was filthy. And, but we get to where we're going safely. Then we take an Uber at the end of a meeting, windows are up, it's air conditioned, it's clean, wonderful. And I thought, well, not that those experiences describe every cab ride and every Uber ride, but in my experience, and I've taken a lot of cabs and a lot of Ubers, Uber's just better. And I thought, why is that? I mean, think about it. The taxi industry is heavily regulated, right? This is the government at the height of its oversight of an industry. And why is it so crappy? And Uber effectively has almost no government oversight. I mean, you've got to have a driver's license, of course, and Uber has its own background checks and so forth, but very little government oversight as compared to the taxi industry, and yet it's so much better. And it occurred to me, what do you do when you get out of an Uber ride? You get that notice that says, rate your driver, and that rating matters. You get out of a taxi, there ain't no rating your driver. He's off to the next rider to stick them in the Boilermaker and roast them as you go somewhere else in Jersey City. Anyway, all right, enough of that, but thought I'd just share that if you hadn't caught that news. The other thing that caught my attention was Tesla, kind of Tesla and Amazon. I need to do a podcast on FANG stocks, wouldn't include Tesla. Recently Facebook got pummeled because they said growth was going to slow and profits were going to cap and maybe go down. And at the same time, Amazon was just exploding because it made a couple of $1 billion in profit, which is a lot of money to you and I. But for a company that size, I mean, Apple makes that kind of profit in a week or two, not a quarter. In any event, it may be worth a podcast. But Tesla's been in the news for a whole host of reasons. Obviously, Elon Musk has been tweeting, and it's gotten him into trouble. First, there's questions about his statements and the company's statements on production of Tesla 3s. And then more recently, his tweet that he was going to take the company private, and he had, quote unquote, funding secured. And so that's gotten everyone up in arms because apparently he doesn't have funding secured, at least not as I would understand that term. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens to Tesla. I have to tell you, I hope it survives because they make a phenomenal product. I just hope the business side of things doesn't get in their way. It was funny, after that tweet from Elon Musk, there were a lot of other tweets that kind of played off that. Like, there was one that said, thinking of taking the family to Chipotle tonight for dinner. Funding secured. Yeah, that's kind of how I feel. Anyway, my neighbor he had a Tesla, he traded in for the P100, whatever, the ludicrous mode that goes 0 to 60 in like 3.5 seconds. I'm not sure why you would need that feature. I could see why it would be fun, but apparently it just snaps your head back to that seat and you are gone. I wouldn't know. Anyway, all right, well, that's the news, kind of, what I have on my mind right now. Like I said, I'm going to come back to the FANG stocks. I really want to talk about valuation and how, at least I think through valuation of individual stocks. I'm not going to do that the next podcast, but maybe I'll do that in September. Really want to compare valuations of like Amazon, Facebook, and say Apple. I think that would be interesting. So I'm going to put that on the calendar. All right, tax loss harvesting. So first, how does this work? What are we even talking about? So let's start with the idea you invest in, could be a stock, could be an ETF, a mutual fund, and let's assume you sell it at a loss. You bought it at $100, you sold it at 90, however many shares you had, you lost some money. The first thing to think about is it a short-term loss or a long-term loss? Short-term losses, you held it for less than a year. Long-term losses, you held it for more than a year. Now that's really important when it comes to gains, right? Because long-term gains are typically taxed at the long-term capital gains rate, which at the moment maxes out, I want to say, to 20%. There could also be the Affordable Care Act tax that gets added to that, depending on your income. Short-term gains typically get taxed at your ordinary income rate. So you could end up paying a lot more if you sell something at a gain before you've held it for 12 months. Short-term losses kind of work the same way. Obviously, there's no tax to pay on a loss because it's a loss, right? You haven't made profit. But they still categorize them between short-term losses, if you held the investment for less than a year, and long-term losses. Now, why is that important? Well, in most cases, I'm going to go on a limb and say in most cases, not real important, because the way it works is, let's say you have a short-term loss. You can use that to offset any short-term gains that you have that year. So if you had a short-term loss of $10,000 and a short-term gain of $10,000, they would sort of wash out, and you don't know taxes, all other items, putting all other items aside. But what if you had more gains or more losses? You had 10,000 in short-term gains, but let's say you had 20,000 in short-term losses. Well, you used 10 of them up to offset the short-term gains, but you've still got 10,000 in short-term losses left. What can you do with that? Well, you can then use it to offset long-term gains, right? And the reverse would be true as well. If you had long-term losses, you could offset those first against long-term gains, and then if you still had losses left over, you could use those to offset against short-term gains, right? And then the question becomes, well, wait a minute, what if you offset all your short-term gains and all your long-term gains, and you still have some losses? What do you do there? Well, you can then use up to $3,000 of those losses to offset other income, right? And you say, well, 3,000? Why 3,000? I don't know. That's just the rule. And then the next question is, well, what if you offset the 3,000 and you still have more losses? Maybe it was a really bad year. Well, you carry them over to the next year. That's what you do, and you start all over, right? I mean, that's basically losses, investment losses in a nutshell. Now, I will stress, I am not a tax accountant. I'm not a tax lawyer. I don't play one on TV. I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn Express. So if you want tax advice, don't get it from this podcast because you won't find it here. I'm giving you my understanding of the taxes as it relates to the short-term and long-term losses and tax loss harvesting, but it ain't gospel. If you need professional help, go talk to a tax accountant or a tax lawyer. But that's my understanding in a nutshell. Now, what do we do with that information in terms of tax loss harvesting, and what does the harvesting mean anyway? So the idea is to sort of strategically sell investments at a loss in order to use those losses to perhaps offset some gains, right? For example, let's say you sold an investment, you had a reason to sell it, and you have whatever, $50,000 in long-term gains. And of course, you're going to get taxed on that. And but you also invested in something about the same time, and it's at a $20,000 loss. Well, you could sell that. You could say, okay, I'm going to tax loss harvest. I'm going to sell that investment at a loss. That'll give me $20,000 in losses that I can then use to reduce that $50,000 gain. Now, some might immediately not like that idea. I don't like selling investments at a loss. No one does. But when you evaluate whether you should sell an investment, putting taxes aside for a moment, what you paid for, it's irrelevant, right? It's what it's worth today that matters. I mean, the fact that you may have paid $100,000 for an investment and it's trading at 90 right now should in no way influence whether it's should be sold or not, whether it's what its intrinsic value is today. It could be undervalued. Maybe you've analyzed a stock and you still think your investment's worth $110,000. Fine, don't sell it. But at least not for things other than maybe tax reasons. But what you paid for it emotionally, it absolutely weighs on us, no doubt. But if you put your emotions out of it for a moment, the value of something's got nothing to do with how much you paid for it, 6 months ago or 6 years ago. It's what it's worth today. So if you can get over that, you can sell some investments that you might have at a loss to offset those gains. Right now, obviously, you'd want to confer with your tax advisor in doing that. But that's the basic idea of tax loss harvesting. We're going to sell some investments that are currently at a loss position, so that we can offset others that we've sold at a gain. Now that raises one question: is well, what if I have some investments that are at a loss right now, but I don't have any gains to offset them with? So if I sold them, I could have this loss, and I could use $3,000 of it against other income. But then I'd have a carry forward. Is that really worth doing? Well, it might be, right? Particularly if you think you're going to have some gains next year or maybe the year after. You lock in those losses, and you could use them down the road. Obviously, the sooner you use them, the more valuable they are, right? And so again, it's something to think through and maybe talk with your tax advisor, but they can still have some value even if you can't use them this year. Now, all of that being said, there is a really tricky, well, it's not tricky, but it's something you need to know about tax loss harvesting. And it's called the wash sale rule. Here's the idea. Let's say you own shares of Apple and you sell them at a loss, which right now would probably be impossible because I think they're trading at an all-time high. But in any event, putting that issue aside, you sell them at a loss on day one. And 10 days later, you purchase the Apple shares again because you didn't really want to get out of them. You just wanted to lock in your loss. And and then get back into the position. So you locked in your loss, and 10 days later, you bought them back. You can't do that. That's the wash sale rule. And the idea behind it is the government, the IRS doesn't want you to do something solely for tax reasons. Now, you and I might say, well, how do you really define that? Who's going to say whether it's solely for tax reasons? One person could buy 10 days later and it have nothing to do with tax reasons, right? They could have just, maybe there was an announcement at Apple and they thought, oh, I made a mistake in selling, I want to buy again. It had nothing to do with taxes. And another person, it could have everything to do with taxes, right? I mean, how do you jump into an investor's mind and figure out why they did something? Well, you really can't. So what they've done is they've said, okay, for the wash sale rule, 30 days. So you sell something at a loss, you can't buy it back within 30 days, or you lose the tax loss, at least for the time being. You got to wait that 30-day period before you buy the investment back. It's arbitrary, sure, but it's a way to sort of effectuate this idea of we don't want folks doing something just for tax reasons. Is it a perfect solution? No, but it's the rule, and it's the IRS's rule. Now, you might be thinking, okay, Rob, but I got a plan here. What I'll do is I'm going to buy Apple stock before I sell it. I got 100 grand of Apple stock. I'm going to buy another 100 grand, maybe even in a different account, a week before I then sell the shares that I have at a loss. And that way I'll get around this rule. Well, they've thought of that too. So the 30-day period, it's both 30 days after you sell at a loss, but it also applies 30 days before you sell. So there's this 60-day period around 30 days each side of the sale, the loss sale, that you have to factor in. You can't buy, and the term is a substantially identical investment. We'll talk about what that means in a minute. Obviously, Apple stock is Apple stock, so you can't do it. You can't buy it before the loss for 30 days or after. And then you might say, well, okay, I got another way to do this. Here's what I'll do. I'll sell it, of course, in my taxable account, right? Selling investments at a quote-unquote loss inside a retirement account doesn't trigger any sort of loss for you, right? Because those transactions aren't taxable, right? You pay your taxes on retirement accounts, assuming they're not a Roth, when you take the money out. So this would apply in a taxable account. You think, well, I'll sell my Apple stock at a loss in my taxable account, and then I'll immediately buy it, but I'll buy it in my IRA. That's a retirement account, right? I'll buy it in my IRA, or I'll buy it in my 401k if you can, right? Well, yeah, it doesn't really matter which account you buy it in. The wash sale rule still applies. It gets a little fuzzy, frankly, in that realm, a little bit, but no, you can't do that. So it doesn't matter which account you're buying it in. You got to wait the 30 days. And that's important. So now, then that raises the question, well, what does it mean? What's a substantially identical investment? Great question. Now, again, I'm not a tax expert, but I'm going to give you my view with some examples. Obviously, we were talking about Apple. You sell Apple stock and then you buy it back a day later. Yeah, that's substantially identical investment, in my opinion. If that's not, by the way, I don't know what a substantially identical investment is. Okay, but what about an S&P 500 index fund? Let's say you sold at a loss the Vanguard S&P 500 index investor shares, and then you turned around and bought the Vanguard S&P 500 Admiral shares. Is that a substantially identical investment? If you look it up on Morningstar, the yield is actually different on those two investments by 10 basis points, reflecting the different expense ratios of those two investments. The underlying investments are the same. And by the way, it may surprise you let me just look this up on Morningstar. I looked this up earlier today. It may surprise you. Any idea how many companies are part of the portfolio in Vanguard's S&P 500 index fund? I mean, I would think it's 500, right? I mean, kinda, wouldn't you? Nope, it's 509. And it has 4 bond funds. That surprised me too. VTIAX, I think. I probably got this wrong. AX. Yes, that's the Admiral share. Plugging it into Morningstar. It has a yield of, I think, 284. I don't know where I got the 178 from. 284, and if you go to portfolio, I'm I'm looking at the wrong one. Hang on. I'll get there. Here we go. VFIAX, not VT. VT's International Fund. Yeah, 178. And if you go to their portfolio in Morningstar, it will show you what they own, what's owned inside this mutual fund. And go to holdings. And sure enough, waiting. I know it's 509. Yes, 509 stock holdings. Interesting, 2 bond holdings. It was 4 this morning, so maybe they sold. And then they have other holdings, whatever that is, 4. So the holdings would be the exact same. The only real difference is the expense ratio. I believe those would be substantially identical. Can't prove it. I don't know how the IRS would react to it. I can tell you that I wouldn't risk it. I wouldn't sell at a loss one of Vanguard's 500 index funds and then buy another one within 30 days. Okay, well, what if you sold a Vanguard 500 index fund and bought a Fidelity index fund, S&P 500 index fund? I mean, they both track the S&P 500, so maybe they'd still be substantially identical. It's interesting, in my humble opinion, you have a better argument that these are not substantially identical. By the way, I still wouldn't do it. I wouldn't risk it. There's no point in it. Why risk it? But the yield is different. The expense ratios are different. But as importantly, maybe more importantly, the actual holdings are different. They don't have 509 equity positions in their S&P 500 index fund. Now, it's not hugely different, but it's different. They have 505, and they have no bond holdings. So you could at least make the argument, right? At this point, you may be saying, okay, Rob, yeah, I wouldn't risk that either. But why do we even have to worry about this? Can't we just sell whatever investment it is, say the Vanguard 500 index fund, and just leave it in cash for 30 days, and then on day 31 or day 35, if you want to be extra safe, just buy it back? Yeah, you can, absolutely. Some folks, I have to confess, I'm included in this group, don't like to have their asset allocation out of whack that much, even for a month. You know, I mean, is it the end of the world? No. But it kind of gnaws at me. And so what I believe you could do, among other things, is sell an S&P 500 index fund and replace it for 30 days or maybe longer with a total U.S. market index fund. To me, those are vastly different, right? I mean, you're talking about roughly 500 companies versus in the Vanguard total stock market, there's got to be at least 3,000, I'm guessing. VTSMX. VTSMX. Vanguard, I think that's just U.S. I want to say it's around 3,000 holdings, 3639, yeah. So, you know, different yield, different expense ratio. I mean, it's going to have different volatility. I don't know. I'd find it hard to believe someone could argue that this would be substantially identical. Again, don't quote me on that. You do your own analysis. That's my belief. You could do the same thing. You could combine things. Let's say you have a developed markets index fund, which is foreign, of developed countries, and then you have an emerging market, and that's how you divide it up. And they're both at a loss. You could sell them both and then immediately take that money and just put it in a total international stock market fund. That fund is going to be significantly different than those two funds. Actually, it's even going to be different than those two funds combined, in my opinion. And that's effectively what I did this year. I had a lump sum to invest. And the investments have done very well, particularly on the U.S. side. But the international funds had losses, pretty significant, because the international stocks have been down. So I sold them. I locked in a loss that I probably won't use this year. I'd say I'd probably use it next year. But it was easy to do. There's no transaction costs, and I can immediately put it in a different investment. And, again, you could go total international. You could pick one of Vanguard's actively managed funds for a bit, up to you. But I put it in a totally different fund, so I wasn't out of the market. And then that investment went down right away, too. I almost sold again. But I decided I just didn't, and then in a couple of days it went back up, and it's now basically at a break even. But it was nice to get those losses, and I can use them. They'll have value to me. Again, even if I don't have long-term gains this year, of course, I'll use 3,000 of it to offset other income. And then I definitely have some gains in some other positions. And, if nothing else, I can liquidate one, recognize the gain, offset that gain with the losses that I have, and then buy it back, and I'll buy it back at a higher basis, right? So anyway, that's kind of what brought this to my mind. You want to be careful. You want to make sure you get it right. There's a lot of different ways for this to go wrong. And so, I definitely advise you to read up on it and to talk to your tax advisor. But tax loss harvesting can be a very smart tool to use. Again, it's going to be relevant in your taxable account. And that's true also with robo-advisors that do sort of automated tax loss harvesting. Only going to apply in a taxable account. If you open up an IRA at Betterment, there's no tax loss harvesting going on inside an IRA. But inside a taxable account, they automate that process. I think long-term, there's probably a limit to how much tax loss harvesting can do for you. And what I mean by that is this. The tax loss harvesting I did this year was off of investments that I made this year. I'm, as you know, a buy and hold investor, so I'll hold investments for a very, very long time. So eventually, even if the investment hasn't done as well as I hoped, they're at such a large gain that there's never going to be tax. If there's tax loss harvesting on some of my really, really long-term holdings, we're in big, big trouble. I mean, take Apple, for example. I bought it before the split at like $56. So Apple today is at what, $217, I think, maybe? Let's just look, check it out. $215. So if it goes down below $56, the wheels have come off. I'll have bigger problems, at least with that investment, than tax loss harvesting. So I think it can be a short-term thing where you've recently invested in the last year or two, and maybe the market's gone down. Over time, though, it's going to end up not having much value when you've held an investment for a really long time, because you're likely going to be in a gain position, not at a loss. But for those investments maybe you've made in the last year or two where you might have a loss, something worth considering, could save you some taxes down the road. Just again, make sure you're aware of the wash sale rule. 30 days both before and after the lost sale. Can't buy a substantially identical investment. By the way, I love that terminology, a substantially identical investment. How's that different than identical? What is there an investment out there that would be substantially identical but not identical? I suppose you could say that S&P 500 index fund might be an example of that, where the only difference is the expense ratio. How about this one? One more example, then I'll let you go. What if you owned A shares of Berkshire Hathaway, which, by the way, are trading at like 300 and some thousand, I think. Let's see, $312,260. And you sold them and immediately bought Berkshire B, which is trading at 207 and is worth, I think, 1/30th. I think. I own B shares, so I should know this, but I think it's 1/30th of an A share. Are those substantially identical? Maybe, except that the A shares can vote. The A shares have voting rights, the B shares don't. I would argue that is a very significant difference. Whether the IRS would see that as a significant difference, I'm not so sure. By the way, I wouldn't risk it. Well, first of all, I don't own A shares, and I don't plan to sell B shares and buy an A share. And if I did sell the B shares, they wouldn't be at a loss. Okay. But if I owned, say, A shares and they were at a loss, I wouldn't sell them and immediately buy B shares. Just no reason to take that risk. But it's kind of an interesting question. Don't know how the IRS would come out on that. So there you go. If you have any questions, leave them on the Facebook group, doorroller.net/Facebook group. In fact, the next podcast, which is going to cover emergency savings and how to manage it, came out of a question in the Facebook group. Great question, great responses from the members there. And so I thought, I'm just going to turn this into a podcast episode. I think it'll help a lot of people. And I learned some stuff from it. So it was terrific. So that's going to be the next episode. But if you have questions about tax loss harvesting, personal finance, investing, whatever, or chess is always a fair topic to discuss under any set of circumstances. Head over to the Facebook group. Again, you can get to it by going to doorroller.net/Facebook group. That will redirect you. You can join. We'd love to have you. I think we're up to almost 6,000 people, 5,500, 6,000, something like that. It's like a small town. And we'd love to see you there. Hey, until next time, remember, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.